You ever step on something you weren't supposed to notice? The question barely had time to settle before Edward Vaughan's polished shoe sank into something soft beside the overflowing dumpster, and the world around him, honking traffic, distant chatter, the low hum of a city that never cared, seemed to mute itself as he looked down and saw her, a woman curled tightly between black trash bags, her body tucked in against the cold concrete like she was trying to disappear from it. And when she flinched and slowly lifted her head, strands of hair catching the flicker of a broken streetlight, his breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him harder than anything he'd felt in years. Naomi! Her name left his mouth quieter than expected, almost unsure, as if saying it too loud might shatter whatever fragile truth he was staring at, because this wasn't possible, not her, not the same woman who used to move silently through his glass-walled penthouse, leaving everything spotless, everything in order, the woman he had once decided to help. With a single signature and a set of keys to an apartment overlooking the Hudson, a place he had barely glanced at twice, but to him it had been enough, it had been everything, or so he believed, and yet here she was, wrapped in layers that barely kept out the cold, hands tucked close to her chest, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match the rest of her situation, and something about that steadiness unsettled him more than the setting itself, more than the smell of damp cardboard and city waste, more than the way the alley narrowed the world into something small and uncomfortable. "What are you doing here?" he asked, but the question came out sharper than intended, edged with confusion, maybe even accusation, because in his mind, this didn't add up, not with the version of reality he controlled, not with the neat, structured outcomes he was used to creating with money and decisions made from behind polished desks. Naomi didn't answer right away, she simply watched him, her breathing slow, measured, as if she had already accepted something he was just beginning to see, and Edward felt a strange pressure build in his chest. Like the moment before a deal went wrong, like the split second when control slips and nothing responds the way it should. "I gave you a place," he said more firmly now, stepping closer, his coat catching the cold air as it shifted around him. "A real apartment. Where is it?" The words echoed slightly in the tight space, and for a moment, the only sound that followed was the rustle of a loose plastic bag shifting in the breeze. Naomi's fingers tightened briefly against the fabric of her sleeve before relaxing again, and when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't broken, wasn't desperate, it was calm, grounded in a way that didn't fit what he was seeing. "Did you ever check what happened after you gave it to me?" The question landed softly, but it hit deeper than anything else in that alley, and Edward felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty. A crack forming in a belief he hadn't questioned in years as the flickering light above them buzzed faintly and somewhere in the distance a siren wailed, stretching thin through the cold night air, and for the first time since he stepped into that alley, Edward Vaughn realized he might not understand this situation at all. Edward did not answer right away because for the first time in a long while he did not have one, his mind searching for a neat explanation, a missing detail, something small he could correct with a phone call or a transfer. But nothing came, only the quiet weight of her question hanging between them, and he realized he had never once followed up, never asked where she slept after that first night, never checked if the keys he handed over had truly opened a door that stayed open. He had simply assumed the story ended the moment he decided it should. "Of course I checked," he said finally, but the words felt thinner than he expected, like paper stretched too far. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, not in disbelief, just in a way that made it clear she was listening more to what he did not say than what he did. A car passed at the end of the alley, its headlights sweeping across the walls for a brief second, illuminating the sharp contrast between his tailored coat and the worn fabric wrapped around her shoulders, and in that passing light he saw something he had overlooked before, not weakness, not defeat, but a kind of quiet resolve that did not belong in a place like this. "You gave me the apartment," she said softly, her voice steady despite the cold air that curled around each word. "And then you went back to your life." Edward frowned, a subtle tightening around his eyes, because that was not how he remembered it. In his mind it had been a moment of generosity, something he had done right, something that proved he was not the kind of man who ignored people like her. "I made sure you were set," he replied, taking a step closer. Without realizing it, as if proximity could restore control. That place costs more than most people make in a year. Naomi gave a small nod, not arguing the number, not challenging the value, but something in her expression shifted, something almost reflective, like she was looking past him, past the alley, back to a moment he had never witnessed. It was beautiful, she said, and for a brief second there was warmth in her voice, a memory catching light. Big windows, real wood floors, heat. That never cut off. Edward felt a flicker of validation, something inside him reaching for that confirmation, but it did not last, because she continued, her tone unchanged. I stood there the first night and did not know where to sit. That image landed differently, not as gratitude, not as praise, but as something heavier, something he had not accounted for, and Edward felt his certainty shift again, just slightly, like the ground beneath him was no longer as solid as he believed. Why would that matter? He asked, the question coming out more quietly now, less like a challenge and more like someone trying to understand a language they had never needed before. Naomi looked at him fully then, her eyes steady, unguarded. Because it was never really mine, she said, and the words did not accuse, they simply existed, plain and unwrapped. You gave me a place, but you never gave me a way to stay in it. Edward blinked, the meaning taking a moment longer to settle than he expected. Because in his world ownership was simple, documented, secured, but in hers it was something else entirely, something tied to things he had never had to think about, and as the cold air moved between them again, carrying the faint scent of rain beginning somewhere beyond the buildings, he realized this was not a story that had ended when he walked away, it was one that had kept unfolding without him. And now he was standing in the part he had never seen, trying to understand how something he believed was enough had led her here. Edward's jaw tightened, not out of anger this time but out of something far more unfamiliar, a slow realization creeping in where certainty used to live. Because for years he had measured impact in numbers, square footage, market value, believing that if something cost enough it had to mean enough. But standing in that narrow alley with the cold pressing through his coat and the faint drip of water echoing from a rusted pipe above, he could not ignore the gap between what he gave and what she had actually received. Then why didn't you say something? He asked, and the question came out quieter than before, stripped of its edge, almost uncertain. Naomi's eyes shifted for a moment, not away from him but inward, like she was tracing back through choices that had already been made and could not be undone. To who? She replied gently, and that single question settled into the space between them heavier than anything else she had said, because Edward realized there had never been a place for her voice in the system he built around himself, no direct line, no moment where he paused long enough to listen, just decisions made quickly and moved past just as fast. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cold air, and for the first time he noticed how still she had been this entire time. How she had not reached out, not asked for help, not even tried to explain herself until he forced the conversation into motion, and that restraint unsettled him more than any accusation could have. That apartment was paid for, he said, almost to himself now, trying to reconstruct the facts. Utilities, maintenance, everything was handled. Naomi nodded once, acknowledging the truth in his words, but her expression did not change. For how long? She asked, and Edward paused, the answer sitting somewhere just out of reach, because he had never considered duration as part of the gesture. In his mind it had been permanent simply because he wanted it to be, but now that assumption felt thin, incomplete. 6 months, he said finally, recalling the terms he had barely glanced at before signing. It was meant to give you a start. Naomi's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything warm. Just a recognition of the intention behind the action. 6 months is a pause, she said softly. Not a future. The words did not carry blame, only clarity, and Edward felt them land in a place he did not usually allow to be touched, a place where his decisions were not automatically right, where outcomes were not guaranteed. Just because he had the power to initiate them, a gust of wind pushed through the alley then, sharper this time, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and something colder, something that made the city feel less controlled, less predictable. Naomi adjusted the edge of her sleeve again, a small movement that spoke louder than any complaint, and Edward noticed it, really noticed it, the way her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. Conserving warmth, conserving energy, like every motion had a cost he had never had to calculate. "You could have stayed," he said, but even as the words left him he knew they were incomplete, that staying required more than walls and a key. Naomi shook her head slightly, her gaze steady on his. "Staying costs more than leaving sometimes," she said, and Edward felt that sentence settle deeper than anything else, because it suggested there were forces at play he had never accounted for, things that could not be solved with a signature or a transfer, and as the first faint drops of rain began to tap against the metal edge of the dumpster beside them, he stood there, not as the man who had fixed the problem, but as someone just beginning to understand that he had never fully seen it at all. The rain began as a thin whisper, barely visible at first, tapping lightly against the metal edges and dark pavement, but Naomi did not move to avoid it. She simply sat there, as if she had already made peace with whatever the night decided to bring, and Edward stood frozen a few feet away, his mind no longer racing for solutions but slowing down, forced to stay in a moment he would normally walk past. "What happened after 6 months?" he asked, and this time there was no edge in his voice, only a quiet need to understand. Naomi glanced upward briefly, feeling the first drops touch her face, then back at him. "The letter came," she said, simple, direct. "Final notice. Lease terms ended." Edward's brow furrowed, because in his world notices were extensions, renegotiations, options, not endings. "You could have renewed," he said quickly, almost instinctively, reaching for the familiar logic that had always worked for him. Naomi gave a small shake of her head. "Renewal needed proof," she replied. "Income. Credit. Stability." Each word landed carefully, like stepping stones across a gap he had never seen, and Edward felt something shift again, because none of those had ever been barriers in his life. They were assumptions, invisible advantages he had never questioned. "I could have handled that," he said, and even to himself it sounded too late. Naomi's expression did not change, not accusing, not bitter, just steady. "You could have," she agreed softly. "But you were not there." The rain grew slightly heavier now, a soft rhythm building around them, and Edward realized that was the truth at the center of everything, not what he gave, not what she lost, but the absence that followed, the silence that filled in the space after his decision. "So you just left?" he asked, but even as he said it he understood how small that question was compared to what it tried to cover. Naomi looked down for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the damp edge of the ground, then back up. "I packed what I could carry," she said. "Left the keys on the counter." The image formed in Edward's mind without permission, a quiet apartment, empty except for echoes, a set of keys placed carefully as if closing a chapter no one else was reading, and something in his chest tightened. "Where did you go?" he asked, and now there was no distance in his voice, no authority, just a man asking another person where their life had taken them. Naomi's eyes drifted past him, toward the mouth of the alley where the city lights blurred through the falling rain. "Where I could," she answered, and those 3 words carried more weight than any explanation, because they held nights without certainty, days without direction, choices made not from preference but from necessity. Edward swallowed slowly, the reality of it settling deeper with every second, and he became aware of how out of place he was in that moment, not because of the alley or the rain or the distance from his usual world, but because he had never learned how to stand in a situation he could not fix instantly. "You should have called someone," he said, but even that felt incomplete. Naomi met his gaze again, calm as ever. "I did not need someone to fix it," she said. "I needed someone to see it." And the words stayed with him, hanging in the air between them as the rain continued to fall, steady now, washing over the alley, over the space between who he thought he had been in her story and who he actually was, and for the first time, Edward Vaughn did not try to move past the discomfort. He stood in it, letting it settle, letting it change something he could no longer ignore. The rain settled into a steady rhythm now, tapping against metal, pooling along the uneven pavement, and Naomi remained where she was. shoulders slightly hunched but her posture still composed, as if dignity was something she refused to let the world take from her, no matter the setting, and Edward stood there watching, his hands at his sides, no longer reaching for his phone, no longer thinking about solutions measured in dollars, because something about this moment resisted that kind of answer. "Why did you not go back to the building?" he asked, his voice quieter than before, almost careful. Naomi glanced at him, then toward the alley entrance where blurred headlights passed like distant memories. "I did," she said, and the words came without hesitation. "I asked for work again." Edward's brow tightened slightly, because that had not been part of the story he told himself, not part of the clean exit he imagined. "And?" he asked, the single word carrying more weight than it should have. Naomi's lips pressed together briefly before she spoke again. "They said the position was filled," she replied, her tone even, not bitter, just factual. "They told me to apply online." Edward let out a slow breath, because he knew what that meant: forms, systems, filters that did not see people, only entries, and he realized he had created a world where access required navigation she was never taught. "You could have asked for me," he said, but even as he spoke he understood how distant that option must have seemed. Naomi shook her head slightly. "You were not there," she said again, repeating the truth that continued to follow him. "And I was not someone who could just walk into your office." The rain dripped from the edge of a nearby pipe, each drop marking time in a way that felt heavier than seconds. Edward looked down briefly, noticing for the first time how the water had begun to soak through the edges of his shoes, a small discomfort that suddenly felt symbolic of something much larger, something he had never had to sit with before. "So you just kept moving," he said, and it was less a question now, more a quiet acknowledgement. Naomi nodded once. "Day to day," she said. "Job to job when I could find one." Her voice remained steady, but there was a softness to it now, not weakness, but something closer to honesty, the kind that did not need to defend itself. Edward felt a weight settle deeper in his chest, because this was no longer abstract. No longer a distant scenario, it was a lived reality unfolding in front of him, and he had been absent from every part of it. "And now you are here," he said, almost to himself. Naomi did not respond immediately, she simply looked at him, and in her eyes there was no blame, no anger, only a quiet presence that made it impossible for him to look away. "For now," she said finally, and those two words carried a kind of acceptance that unsettled him more than anything else, because they suggested she did not see this as an end, just another point in a path she continued to walk alone. The rain fell harder for a moment, bouncing off the pavement, and Edward realized that everything he believed about control, about fixing, about helping, had been built on distance, on the ability to leave once the gesture was made. But standing there now, he could not leave, not in the same way. Not without carrying the weight of what he had just seen, and for the first time in his life, the question forming in his mind was not how much it would cost to change this, but whether he was willing to stay long enough to understand what change actually meant. The rain softened again, turning from sharp drops into a steady mist that clung to the air, wrapping the alley in a quiet that felt almost deliberate, and Edward did not move, not even when the cold began to settle deeper into his clothes, because something inside him refused to step away from this moment unfinished. "You said this is just for now," he said slowly, his voice no longer carrying authority but something closer to uncertainty. Naomi adjusted slightly, pulling her sleeve closer around her hands, her movements small, controlled, like someone who had learned to conserve everything, even warmth. "It always is," she replied, and there was no fear in her tone, only acceptance, as if she had made peace with a world that shifted beneath her without warning. Edward looked at her more closely then, really looked, noticing the details he had overlooked before, the way her shoes were worn down at the edges, the faint tremor in her fingers that she tried to hide, the quiet strength in the way she held herself upright despite everything around her, and he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not guilt exactly, not yet, but awareness, the kind that did not fade once it appeared. "You do not have to stay here tonight," he said, and this time there was no assumption in his voice, no expectation that his words would automatically fix what stood in front of him. Naomi's eyes lifted to meet his, steady as always. "I know," she said, and that simple answer carried more weight than agreement, because it meant she understood the offer, understood the possibility, and still did not move. Edward hesitated, something catching in his thoughts, because he was not used to hesitation, not used to offering something without seeing immediate acceptance. "Then come with me," he said, softer now, not commanding, not even insisting, just offering, the words hanging between them like a bridge that had not yet been crossed. Naomi studied him for a moment, not his clothes, not his status, but him, as if measuring something deeper than what he could provide. "To where?" she asked, and the question stopped him, not because he did not have an answer, but because he realized the answer mattered in a way it never had before. "Somewhere warm," he said after a brief pause. "Somewhere safe." Naomi's gaze did not waver. "Safe for how long?" she asked, and there it was again, the question he had never asked himself, the one that turned temporary into something fragile. Edward felt the weight of it settle fully now, pressing against every assumption he had carried into this alley, and for a moment he did not respond, because he understood that any answer built on convenience would fall apart the same way the last one had. The rain continued to fall, quiet but constant. And he realized this was the first real decision he had faced in a long time. Not a business deal, not a calculated risk, but a choice that required more than resources, it required presence. "As long as it takes," he said finally, and the words came slower than usual, but steadier, grounded in something he was only beginning to understand. Naomi watched him carefully, the silence stretching just long enough to matter, and then she gave a small nod, not of surrender, not of relief, but of acknowledgement, as if she recognized the difference between an offer made from habit and one made with intention, and for the first time since he stepped into that alley, Edward felt the distance between them shift, not disappear, not yet, but change, just enough to suggest that what came next would not be decided by money or impulse, but by whether he was willing to stay and prove that this time, he truly saw her. Edward moved first. Not with the usual certainty that followed him through boardrooms and glass offices, but slowly, deliberately, as if every step now required thought, and when he extended his hand toward Naomi, it was not a command, not an expectation, just an offer left open in the cold air between them. She looked at it for a moment, not hesitant, not afraid, just considering, then placed her hand in his, her fingers cool but steady, and that simple contact shifted something neither of them spoke about, because for once it was not about hierarchy, not about who had more, but about who was willing to stay in the moment without turning away. They stepped out of the alley together, the rain softening against the wider street, city lights reflecting off wet pavement in long streaks of gold and white, and Edward glanced toward his car waiting at the curb, the driver already stepping forward, opening the door without a word, but Edward paused, something catching his attention across the street, a small diner, its neon sign flickering slightly, warm light spilling through fogged windows, people inside leaning over coffee cups, conversations low and steady, ordinary in a way that felt distant from his usual world. "Not yet," he said quietly, almost to himself. Naomi followed his gaze, then looked back at him, a question in her eyes that did not need to be spoken. "You said somewhere warm," she reminded him gently, and Edward nodded once, a small shift in direction that felt larger than it should. "This way," he said, and they crossed the street together, the sound of passing cars blending with the soft hum of the city. When they stepped inside, the warmth wrapped around them immediately, the scent of coffee and something freshly baked filling the air, and for a moment everything slowed, the noise softened, the tension in Edward's shoulders easing just slightly. A waitress glanced up, her eyes flickering briefly over their appearance, the contrast between them clear, but she said nothing, simply nodded toward an empty booth by the window. Edward slid in first, then paused as Naomi took her seat across from him, her hands resting lightly on the table, still composed, still steady, as if this change of setting did not alter who she was. A menu lay between them, untouched, because either of them reached for it right away. "You always sat near the window," Edward said suddenly, the memory surfacing. Without warning, Naomi looked at him, surprised for the first time, just slightly. At the apartment, he added, and she gave a small nod. It was the only place that felt real, she said, and those words stayed with him, because he realized that what he had given her had never fully become hers, not in the way that mattered. The waitress returned with 2 glasses of water, setting them down quietly before stepping away, and Edward picked up his glass, then set it back down without drinking. His thoughts moving slower now, deeper, no longer skimming the surface. I thought I fixed everything, he said, not looking at her, but not looking away either. Naomi did not interrupt, she simply listened, the way she always had, but this time it felt different, because he was not speaking from above, not explaining, just admitting something he had never said out loud. I thought giving you that place meant you would be fine, he continued, his voice steady but lower. I never considered what happened after. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in understanding. Most people do not, she said quietly, and there was no judgment in her tone, just truth, the kind that did not need to be forced. Edward finally looked up at her then, really looked, and in that moment he understood something he had missed before, something simple but undeniable. She had never needed him to rescue her, she had needed him to recognize her reality, to stay long enough to understand it, and as the rain continued to trace patterns down the window beside them, blurring the city into something softer, Edward Vaughn realized that this was not about correcting a mistake with another transaction. This was about learning how to remain, how to listen, and how to rebuild something he had once treated as complete, even though it had never truly begun. The waitress returned with a pot of coffee, the kind that filled the air with a steady warmth, and she poured without asking, as if she understood that silence sometimes needed something simple to sit beside it. Edward watched the dark liquid rise in the cup, the surface trembling slightly before settling, and for a moment he focused on that, on something small and contained, because the larger realization forming in him was harder to hold. Naomi wrapped her hands around the cup but did not drink right away, letting the heat reach her fingers first, and Edward noticed that too, the way she took warmth in stages, carefully, like someone who had learned not to rush what could be lost. You said you did not need someone to fix it, he said slowly, his voice steady but thoughtful. Then what did you need? Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his, and for the first time there was a pause before she answered, not because she did not know, but because she was deciding whether he was ready to hear it. Consistency, she said finally, the words simple but heavy. Not just a moment that changes everything, but someone who stays after it changes. Edward let that settle, because he understood moments, he built his life on them, deals, decisions, turning points, but staying was different, staying required time. Attention, a willingness to remain even when there was no immediate return. I thought helping once was enough, he admitted, not as a defense, but as a realization. Naomi gave a small nod. It can be, she said gently, for people who already have something to stand on. Edward looked down at the table, the wood grain catching the soft light above them, and he saw it then, the gap between intention and reality, the way one act could feel complete from one side and incomplete from the other, and for the first time he did not try to close that gap quickly. He let it remain, let it show him something he had not been willing to see before. I should have checked, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Naomi did not respond immediately, she simply watched him, and in that silence there was no pressure, no expectation, just space, the kind he had never allowed in his own life. I should have asked, he continued, his voice lower now. I should have made sure it did not end when I walked away. Naomi's expression softened slightly, not in approval, but in recognition, as if she could see the shift happening in real time. You are asking now, she said, and those words carried a quiet acknowledgement that mattered more than any apology. Edward looked up at her again, and something in his posture changed, something less rigid, less certain, but more present. Then let me ask you this, he said, his voice steady again, but different, grounded in something new. What does staying look like for you? Naomi glanced down at her hands still wrapped around the cup, then back at him, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, clear, unguarded. It looks like not disappearing after the first solution, she said. It looks like showing up when nothing is urgent, when there is nothing to fix, just to understand. Edward felt that settled deeper than anything else she had said, because it required something he had never practiced, something that could not be delegated or automated. It required him. Fully, consistently, and as the rain continued to trace quiet lines down the window beside them, he realized that this was the moment where everything could either return to what it was or become something entirely different, and for once, he did not look for the fastest way forward. He stayed right there, across from her, listening, understanding that what came next would not be measured in what he gave, but in whether he remained. Edward did not speak right away, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time he understood that silence was not something to fill, it was something to honor. The diner around them moved in its quiet rhythm, cups clinking softly, though conversations blending into a steady hum, and outside the rain continued to fall, tracing slow lines down the glass like time itself had decided to slow down with them. He reached for his cup then, not out of habit but intention, and took a small sip, the warmth settling into him in a way that felt grounding, real. Naomi watched him without expectation, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had already accepted whatever direction this moment would take. "I cannot change what already happened," he said finally, his voice calm, no longer trying to justify, no longer trying to explain, just stating what was true. Naomi gave a slight nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, and he continued. "But I can decide what happens next." The words were simple, but they carried a weight he had never attached to them before, because this time they were not about control, they were about responsibility. Naomi's gaze softened just slightly, not in approval, but in recognition of something shifting, something becoming more real than before. Edward placed his cup down carefully, the sound quiet but deliberate, and leaned forward just enough to close the distance between them, not physically, but in presence. "Not another apartment," he said, almost to himself, as if correcting a version of his thinking that no longer fit. "Not something that ends when I walk away." Naomi did not interrupt, she simply listened, the same way she always had, but now it felt different, because he was not speaking from above, he was speaking from within the moment they shared. "I will show up," he said, and the words came slower, but stronger. "Not just tonight, not just when it is easy, but after, when nothing is urgent, when there is nothing to fix." The rain outside softened again, the city lights blurring into a quiet glow behind him, and for a moment everything felt still, suspended between what had been and what could become. Naomi studied him carefully, not his clothes, not his status, but his words, measuring them against something deeper, something that could not be bought or promised lightly, and after a long second, she gave a small nod, not of trust fully given, but of possibility allowed, and that was enough. Edward did not reach across the table, did not try to close the space too quickly, he simply remained where he was. Present, steady, letting the moment breathe. Outside, a car passed, its headlights briefly illuminating the window before fading again, and inside, the warmth held, quiet and consistent. Naomi finally lifted her cup and took a sip, the smallest of actions, but it marked something, a shift, a beginning that did not announce itself loudly, and Edward watched, not with satisfaction, not with relief, but with understanding, because for the first time he was not measuring the outcome. He was part of the process, and as the night moved forward without urgency, without conclusion, the space between them was no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what was now being built, slowly, intentionally, one moment at a time, and in that quiet, without any need for words, it became clear that this time, he was not leaving.